That's a podcast. Talk about it, think about it, discuss it. That's a podcast.
Welcome to our deep dive into freedom with Timothy Snyder's On Freedom. We got a really interesting mix here: his personal stories, American history, and philosophy.
Yeah, he's got a unique way of using those personal stories to explain these big ideas. Really makes you stop and think, about what freedom actually means.
Not just some simple definition we hear all the time.
Exactly.
It's not just about a lack of rules. It's more about,
what you do with it, right?
Yeah, what we actually do with that freedom and how what we do affects everyone else. Okay, so Snyder starts off, and it's pretty intense, with a story about nearly dying from a burst appendix. And what's wild is that he was in Germany at the time, so he had healthcare, but he chose to wait to get treatment.
Yeah, and he uses this whole experience to kind of critique this idea of what's called negative freedom, which is all about just getting rid of those outside barriers. So here he was, free to get medical help, but something internal, his own stubbornness almost killed him.
So it's like our mindset can be a barrier to freedom even when everything outside seems okay. It's like what he says about just seeing our bodies as limits. What do you think about that?
Well, he brings up this concept called libe from Edith Stein. It's not just your physical body, it's like your whole experience, how you feel and think and interact with the world.
Okay.
So it's about recognizing we're not just some mind floating around, but, actual living beings.
Right, we're not just brains in jars.
Exactly.
So just getting rid of those outside walls isn't enough. We need to really understand the inner barriers, our own and other people's too.
Definitely a shift in how we see things. And it makes us think about, the responsibility that comes with freedom.
Like what we choose to do, how does it affect us and everyone else?
Right.
Okay, so freedom's more complicated than just no rules, but then what is it really about? What makes us truly free?
This is where Snyder talks about Václav Havel, the Czech dissident and later, president. Havel said, freedom is a life principle.
Like a way of being.
Like a way of being in the world. And he believed it was all about unpredictability, not just conforming.
Okay.
And he actually lived this out, defending this rock band, the Plastic People of the Universe, against this communist regime.
A rock band. How does that connect to freedom?
It's crazy how it all happened, A hurricane in Cuba, a Berry Gordy Jr. song, then the Velvet Underground, inspiring this Czech band that ends up like a symbol of resistance.
Yeah.
This whole chain of events shows us that freedom thrives on these unexpected connections and having the courage to just challenge what's expected.
So it's like instead of letting the dominoes fall in that same old pattern, you knock one over in a totally different direction and see what happens.
Exactly. And that's what people with strong values bring to the world, that unpredictability, that disruption. That's where true freedom comes in. It's not just sitting back, it's creating something new.
So we've got this idea of Leib and Havel's life principle. How does Snyder bring all of this together to actually define freedom?
He gives us these 5 key forms of freedom: sovereignty, unpredictability, we just talked about that, mobility, factuality, and solidarity. It's not just one thing, it's like this whole interconnected system.
5 forms. Okay, we need to unpack that for sure. Let's start with sovereignty. What does he mean by that?
He uses a story about visiting his grandparents' farm in Ohio, a place with this deep family history and feeling of being rooted. And he compares this to his time in the Soviet Union where, the economy was so centralized, it just squashed individual choice.
So it sounds like sovereignty is more than just owning land or having political power.
Right. It's about having the ability to make decisions that actually shape your own life and your community. And he connects this back to growing up during the Cold War. He's that constant fear, of nuclear war made everyone focus just on surviving that negative freedom we were talking about instead of actually building a better future.
Yeah, when you're worried about the world ending, who has time to think about anything else?
It's like that. And Snyder says sovereignty is about reclaiming that ability to act, to understand ourselves and our place in the world.
That reminds me of what he said about, not just seeing our bodies as limitations. How does that tie into sovereignty?
If we just see our bodies as objects, things to be controlled or used, we miss out on actually experiencing freedom. Remember Stein's concept of libe. It's about recognizing that our bodies aren't separate from our minds. They're how we experience everything, make choices.
So to be truly sovereign, we have to understand and value our bodies as a part of who we are.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our physical selves, our libe, aren't just limits. They're sources of knowledge and power.
This is making me think about, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Snyder talks about that, right?
He does. And he points out that liberty is right there in between life and the pursuit of happiness for a reason.
They're all connected.
Yeah.
If we don't value and protect life, ours and others, then liberty doesn't really mean much, does it?
You can't exactly have freedom if you're not alive.
Right.
And Snyder uses his appendix story to drive that point home. He was stuck in a system where profit was more important than his health. Bureaucracy and money almost cost him his life.
It makes you realize that even in a country that's all about freedom, the systems we create can work against us.
Yeah, and it circles back to sovereignty. If we don't even have control over our own bodies and well-being, how can we be free to make choices about our lives?
That's a powerful point. It seems like sovereignty, really understanding and taking back our ability to act, is like the basis for all the other forms of freedom.
Definitely a key foundation.
So what's next? Are we ready for mobility?
Let's dive in. So Snyder uses this kind of awkward encounter to illustrate this one. He talks about being in an elevator with a Russian scholar, Georgy Arbatov, and these 2 African-American football players.
Oh, I remember that story. Really gets at how complex race and mobility are in America. What happened?
So Snyder was taking Arbatov, who obviously came from a very different culture, to a banquet at Yale. And in the elevator, Arbatov looks at these football players and says "My, you are certainly very big doys."
And that probably didn't go over so well.
Not really. For the players, it brought up this long history of just being seen as bodies, objects to be judged instead of people. It showed how their freedom to move through the world, to be seen as equals, was still limited by racism.
It shows how even a simple space, like an elevator, can be a place where people are fighting for freedom.
Yeah, and it points to all this historical baggage that America has: westward expansion, pushing out Native Americans, Jim Crow laws that restricted Black people's movement, and the fight for equal rights that continues today.
So for Snyder, mobility is not just about moving around physically. It's about being able to fully participate in society.
Right, having equal access to resources and opportunities. And it's about breaking down those systems and mindsets that create those barriers and realizing that true freedom means everyone has mobility, not just a select few.
And this is where we get into how the American dream changed, right? From this idea of opportunity for all to something much more limited.
Exactly. Snyder shows us how the American dream kind of got twisted in the late 20th century. Instead of helping everyone move up, we saw mass incarceration and fewer chances for a lot of people.
Like we pulled up the ladder, but only for a select few.
That's a good way to put it. And this is where imperial mobility and social mobility come in.
Okay, break those down for me.
So imperial mobility is all about expanding, but at someone else's expense. Like with westward expansion, Native Americans were forced off their land. One group wins, the other loses.
So social mobility is the opposite of that.
Yeah, it's about creating ways for people to move up in society. Things like education, fair work practices, and healthcare. Everyone gets a chance to do well.
So Snyder's saying that for America to be truly free, we need to shift from that imperial way of thinking to social mobility.
Yeah, and he connects this to solidarity. True freedom means recognizing that we're all connected, that we all rise and fall together. He's critical of this idea that it's either entrepreneurship or social justice. He says we need both for a free society.
It's not a choice between the two, right?
Exactly.
We can't have a strong economy if a big chunk of people are just struggling to get by. It's about a system where everyone has a chance to contribute and benefit. And this brings us to another really important form of freedom, factuality. Ready to tackle that one?
Let's do it. It feels especially relevant now with all the information and misinformation flying around.
It really does. Where do we even start with this one?
Well, Snyder compares his experience growing up, reading multiple local newspapers, to what we have today. All these news deserts all over America. And he sees this decline of local journalism as a real threat to freedom.
Because without good information, we can't make good choices, right? We can't hold our leaders accountable.
Exactly. Snyder says free speech doesn't really mean anything if we don't care about the truth. We need a strong, independent press that digs deep, keeps us informed, and exposes what's wrong.
And that's where social media and misinformation really become a problem.
Yeah, and it's a complicated problem. Social media is designed to keep us hooked, even if it means showing us stuff that's just wrong. They create echo chambers where people just see what they already believe, whether it's true or not.
Makes it hard to know what's real anymore.
And to make things even more difficult, Snyder talks about AI, artificial intelligence, that will actually make up what people want to hear, which makes things even less factual.
That's a scary thought, especially since AI is getting better all the time.
It is. It really raises this urgent question of, how do we protect truth in a world where algorithms and AI are shaping so much of what we see?
So we're living in a time when the facts are constantly being questioned and manipulated. How do we make sure factuality stays a key part of freedom?
That's the big question, isn't it? But for now, let's switch gears to the last form of freedom in Snyder's framework: solidarity. Remember those students he taught in prison?
Yeah, the ones who use the idea of the big zone to describe how limited freedom can be in America. It must have been powerful to hear that from people living within a system that's supposed to be all about freedom.
It was. They showed how even in a country that calls itself free, there are systems that hold people back and make them feel trapped.
And that's where solidarity comes in, right? Understanding that true freedom means working together to change those systems and build a more just society for everyone.
It's about seeing the humanity in every person, no matter their background, and understanding that we're all in this together. We can't be truly free if others are oppressed.
So it's not just about feeling bad for people, it's about actually doing something to create a world where everyone can thrive.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that freedom isn't a competition, it's something we build together.
Okay, so we've gone through all 5 forms of freedom: sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, and now solidarity. But what does all this mean in the digital age, where we're constantly bombarded with information and our attention is pulled in every direction? Are we actually becoming LSS free?
That's the question, isn't it? And it takes us right into the next part of Snyder's book, where he digs into the challenges and opportunities of the digital world. We'll get into all of that in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll be talking about brain hacks and this idea of nemesis and exploring real steps we can take to reclaim our freedom in this digital world.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. This is some seriously thought-provoking stuff. Can't wait to continue this conversation.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Timothy Snyder's On Freedom. Last time we were getting into how those 5 forms of freedom play out in the digital age. Sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, solidarity.
Yeah, because it feels like all this stuff that's supposed to connect us, the internet, social media, AI, it's also like controlling us in new ways. Kind of weird, right?
It is. And Snyder tackles that head on. He brings up this concept of brain hacks, basically ways that social media companies and others use to exploit our psychology,
Brain hacks. Sounds kind of scary, like something out of a movie. You mean they're messing with our minds on purpose?
It's not quite mind control, but they're definitely playing with how our brains work. Think about it. You're scrolling through your feed and boom, something pops up that makes you feel angry or outraged or super happy. That's not by accident.
So they're designed to keep us hooked, even if they have to manipulate our feelings.
Exactly. Snyder talks about 5 main brain hacks to watch out for. The first one is disorientation. You're constantly getting bombarded with notifications, updates, breaking news, all this stuff. It makes it hard to think straight.
Oh, I totally get that. Like my brain's going in a million directions at once. No wonder I feel so scattered.
And that's what they want. They want you distracted. Another one is intermittent reinforcement. Remember those experiments where they trained animals to press a lever but only gave them a reward sometimes? Turns out, we love those unpredictable rewards.
Like getting a like or comment.
Exactly. Social media uses that to keep us scrolling and scrolling.
So it's like we're all lab rats in this big digital experiment.
It's kind of creepy when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
And it gets even worse. Snyder also talks about source hacking, which is where our trust in the news and experts gets eroded. Makes it easier for propaganda and fake news to spread.
Oh yeah, I see stuff online all the time and I'm like, wait, is this even true?
Exactly. They're messing with our ability to tell what's real. And once that's gone, it's way easier to manipulate us. Then there's emotional amplification, where they basically make us feel more angry or scared on purpose.
Like they're throwing fuel on the fire of all our anxieties and making us turn against each other.
You got it. And the last one, which is kind of the glue that holds it all together, is cognitive dissonance. This is that uncomfortable feeling we get when we do something that goes against our values. The scary part is that once we've been manipulated into doing something, like sharing fake news or attacking someone online, we spend all our energy trying to justify it.
So we end up defending stuff that we know is wrong just so we don't feel bad about ourselves. This is getting pretty dark. It feels like we're trapped in this web of manipulation. Is there any way out?
It could definitely feel that way. But Snyder doesn't just leave us feeling hopeless. He reminds us that we still have choices. We can learn about these techniques, question what we're seeing, and just be more aware of how we're using these platforms.
So it's not about giving up technology. It's about using it in a way that helps us stay free.
Exactly. It's about taking back our sovereignty in the digital world. And that's where understanding this idea of nemesis comes in. This is what tries to control us by figuring out what we're going to do next and pushing us towards those actions.
Nemesis. Sounds like some kind of villain from a comic book.
I know, right? But the idea is actually pretty important. Think about all the data that's collected about us online, our browsing history, what we buy, who we follow. It's all used to create these profiles of who we are and what we're likely to do.
So it's like we're becoming predictable.
In a way, yes. And then that predictability is used to manipulate our choices. Targeted ads, personalized news feeds, all those suggestions that nudge us towards certain things.
So they're narrowing down the possibilities for us, using our own data to box us in.
And that goes against what Havel was talking about, that unpredictability being key to freedom. When our actions become predictable, we become easier to control.
This is really making me think about the future of freedom. It's like we're giving up control of our choices to these algorithms and data. What can we even do about it?
Snyder argues that we have to get involved in shaping the digital world, not just accept how it is. He says we need stronger rules for social media companies, more transparency about how our data is being used, and a bigger focus on privacy.
So it's not just about our individual choices. It's also about the laws and policies that govern the internet.
Exactly. We have to push back against this idea that the internet is somehow different, that our values don't matter online. Freedom of speech, privacy, the right to decide for ourselves, those all still apply.
This is a lot to think about. We're fighting against these brain hacks, this nemesis, and the erosion of truth and solidarity.
I know it seems like a lot, but Snyder doesn't just list the problems. He gives us some concrete things we can do to take back our freedom in the digital world.
Okay, I'm ready for some solutions. How do we fight back?
He starts with something really basic, the right to vote. He says that protecting and expanding voting rights is crucial for healthy democracy. It makes it harder for those in power to take advantage of the system.
Yeah, if people don't have a say in how things are run, it's easier for those in power to exploit them.
Exactly. And he ties this back to mass incarceration, which has stripped away the right to vote for so many people, especially in Black and brown communities.
It's like a double whammy. First, you take away people's freedom, then you take away their voice so they can't change anything.
It shows how all these different forms of freedom are linked. Mobility, sovereignty, political participation, it's all connected.
So expanding voting rights, especially for those who've been marginalized, is a huge part of reclaiming freedom. What else can we do?
Snyder lays out some specific ideas for regulating social media companies. Things like requiring them to be more open about how they use our data, giving users more control, and limiting targeted ads.
These are some pretty big ideas, especially since the tech industry has pretty much been allowed to do whatever it wants.
They are, but Snyder argues that they're necessary to protect our freedom in this digital age. He believes technology can actually help us be more free, but only if it's designed with our values in mind.
So it's not about hating technology, it's about using it to benefit humanity, to make us more free.
Exactly. We'll talk more about that in part 3.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Timothy Snyder's On Freedom. We've covered a lot of ground, personal stories, history, politics, the digital age. Now it's time to tackle that big question.
What does it actually mean to be free?
Right. We've talked about those 5 forms of freedom, sovereignty, unpredictability, mobility, factuality, and solidarity, and how they're being challenged in this digital world. But how do we actually live them? What does it look like in our everyday lives?
That's where Snyder says we need to take action.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't just want us to understand these ideas. He wants us to embody them, put them into practice.
So it's not enough to just think about freedom. We have to actually build it into our lives and our society.
Exactly. And he gives us some real world examples. Like, remember when we talked about local journalism?
Yeah.
He says that supporting local news isn't just about staying informed. It's about investing in factuality, making sure those sources of truth are strong.
It makes you realize that you can't have a free society if people are being lied to or manipulated.
Exactly. And he links this to solidarity. We need to start seeing journalism as something we all benefit from, something we all need to support.
So it's recognizing that my freedom depends on your freedom too. If my neighbor is being misled, it affects me too.
And this takes us to one of Snyder's most important points. Voting rights are crucial for a free society.
He's really serious about that, isn't he?
He is. Denying someone the right to vote weakens democracy and makes it easier for those in power to, take advantage.
It's like taking away their voice, their ability to make a difference.
Exactly. And he's especially critical of how mass incarceration has been used to take away voting rights from millions, particularly Black and brown communities.
It's like a deliberate attempt to silence those voices.
It is. And Snyder brings this back to mobility, saying that true freedom means not just physical movement, but the ability to participate fully in society, to have the same opportunities as everyone else.
And that means changing the systems that create those barriers and that inequality.
A big job, for sure. But Snyder also has some pretty radical ideas about how we can actually reshape the digital world to make it more free. Remember those 10 principles for data privacy?
Oh yeah, like a digital bill of rights.
Exactly. He's saying that our basic freedoms need protection online, just like they do offline.
It's like we've been treating the internet like it's some separate world where the rules don't apply.
And he pushes back against this idea that free speech means anything goes online. He says real free speech has to be based on truth, and it can't be used to hurt others.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it?
Yeah, between freedom of expression and protecting people from harm. And this brings us back to sovereignty. Snyder says we need to take back control of our digital lives, be more aware of how our data is being used, and demand more transparency from those tech companies.
It's like we've gotten so used to the convenience of technology that we've forgotten to ask, what are we giving up for it?
And that's the question Snyder wants us to ask. He reminds us that freedom isn't just handed to us. We have to fight for it every single day, and we have to do it together.
One thing that really stood out to me in his book is how connected all these different forms of freedom are.
They work together, huh?
Yeah, it's like a puzzle. All the pieces fit.
Yeah.
He uses this analogy of a tree. Each form of freedom is like a branch growing out from the trunk of sovereignty, but they're all part of the same tree, all connected.
It's a great image, and it shows how freedom is always growing and changing.
And that we can't just focus on one piece of it. We need to care for the whole tree.
It takes a holistic approach, seeing how everything is linked, our lives, the systems we create.
This deep dive has really made me rethink freedom. It's not just about my individual rights. It's about building a world where everyone has the chance to live a good life.
And that means not just tearing down walls, but building something new, something better.
It's about understanding ourselves, the world, the things that try to limit our choices, and then taking action.
And it's about making a choice to fight for that freedom, individually and together. That's what Snyder's getting at, I think.
That's a powerful message, especially these days.
It is. Snyder's book is a call to action, a reminder that freedom isn't something we just have, it's something we have to constantly work towards.
So what does all of this mean for you? Do you feel inspired to challenge things and reclaim your freedom? Or do you feel overwhelmed by all the challenges? What really resonated with you from this deep dive?
I think Snyder's message is ultimately one of hope. He reminds us that freedom isn't a choice, a commitment we make, and a struggle that never ends. It's not given, we have to fight for it.
Exactly. And like he says, it all starts with understanding ourselves, the world, and what's trying to hold us back, and then using that understanding to create positive change. One last thought for you all out there. What if you could redesign the digital world? What kind of technology would you create that would empower people and make them more free? What would a truly free digital world look like to you? That's it for our deep dive into freedom, but the conversation doesn't have to end here. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a world where everyone has the chance to be truly free.